absolutely fascinating day today. And at the end, here I am at the end thinking, well, at least you lot are not all running to get trains to get home. That's one thing about doing that online. And I even managed to go and hang out the washing partway through the conference. I've learned a lot, and I'm sure you've learned a lot as well. And I thought to myself, if I'm the final one, how can I sort of in a sense, kind of pull it together? And I thought I wanted to look back at the sort of things I've learned over the years of dealing with organisations, looking at crisis communications. I used to be a journalist, and then I moved into media training, and I found myself fairly quickly media training councils and NHS trusts and blue light organisations, as well as a private and third sector. I found myself dealing with the negative stories. I found myself dealing with local authorities with serious case reviews. That seemed to be one of the main ones that I did. And I suddenly realised I needed to understand what to train people when things weren't quite going right. It's all very well learning how to do media training and how to do an interview and stand correctly and wear the right blouse or shirt or whatever, but what do you need to actually say? And that was suddenly where I started finding myself getting into crisis communications. And from there, I've ended up going into lots of organisations, helping them with crisis comms plans, helping them in the middle of a crisis, and also exercising with them as well. And what I found is that sometimes we can do a lot of planning, and I think the stuff about planning has been talked a lot today, which is really important. But even so, there are pitfalls and common pitfalls that kind of came up time and again. There were mistakes that came up time and again, and I thought, well, maybe I should share these. Maybe I should say these are just the little tiny, some of them tiny detail, which come up, and it's not just once or twice. They maybe come up on several occasions with different organisations. So I've sort of gone through and come up with common pitfalls that I've seen, and I've seen organisations fall into, and I sort of wanted to go through those, and some of these you may have fallen into, or we may have even heard about them a little bit today. And they're really easy to slightly, in the middle of a crisis or in a day-to-day job, we're not going to get everything right. I'm certainly not saying I get everything right. None of us do, but I think it's just useful to take some of these on board. The first one that I've come across quite a bit is what I'm going to call the not seeing the crisis coming in the first place. And this is one of those things that we are all, we're in the middle of doing our jobs, and to find time to stop and horizon scan and risk assess and do a bit of that, sort of looking outwards or looking inwards as well, and try and think about potential crises. We don't really have time. Having said that, I think, and it's been talked about, I think COVID has changed the nature. I think people have realised that crises happen. No one expected COVID, and it's been a massive crisis. So we started to realise that maybe we do need to plan for crises, and I think that's starting to embed more in organisations. And I am certainly finding that people are suddenly starting to think about planning this. But it could be that there is a crisis coming up, and it's almost like it's coming towards you, and somehow nobody picks up on it. Now, sometimes this can be the senior management team. They know about it, but they're almost like too mesmerised to do anything. Or they know about it, but they don't think to tell comms. And that's quite a common thing as well. You are the CEO, you're in the senior management team, and you know that somewhere down the line, there's a court case coming up, there's a report coming up, there's an inquiry happening, there's some issue with a member of staff, or something happening, and you don't actually tell the comms team. You perhaps deal with it in a silo. This is another thing about how people work in silos. So, for example, I had a company that rang me and said, we serious fraud office are investigating us, and it's going to go in the Financial Times today, or on their website today. Can you get here in 15 minutes? It turned out that the serious fraud office had raided them 18 months before. And they hadn't thought right up until the last minute that they needed to have some sort of communication strategy around it. So they could see it coming, it was coming on the horizon, but they hadn't actually thought about the comms side of it. So that's another thing that can happen. Similarly, a public sector, I won't say which local authority, but a local authority that was embroiled in a very, very high profile case a few years ago. where they knew this certain report was going to be published. 2 working days before it was published, suddenly decided that perhaps they'd better do something about how they were going to communicate. And yet they knew this report was coming up. It had a massive implications for their reputation. But again, senior management team knew all about it and didn't tell the comms team. And that kind of flags up something that came up really early in the day in the conference. If you remember, there was talk about, where do comms people sit? And that's a really important point. Do comms people sit in the senior management team, in the senior leadership team, and hear about the stuff in the first place? So you've got some comms input into it. And I think that's something that is a point to take on board. And I think, we've talked earlier in the day about how comms people are much more in that C-suite and certainly should be. So it might be the senior management team know about the crisis, but don't do anything about it. It could also be that the people on the front line know about an issue which becomes a crisis, but don't know how to flag that up. So your contact centre team may have heard of something, your frontline staff may have heard of complaints, but they don't know how to tell anybody that there is this crisis coming, there are these issues being raised. So, and that was interesting when I think David Bailey talked about all the social media channels that there can be with the police, for example, and you may not pick all of that up. So that was interesting. It's, stuff is out there, but it's not getting picked up. So that makes you start thinking, and it makes me start thinking about the importance of horizon scanning, about thinking about looking in all different directions, not just outward at potential crises, but inward as well, and internal comms. We talked about internal comms today and the importance of people being able to feed back concerns and issues. If you've got staff on the front line hearing about complaints and yet they don't know where to take that to, then you will end up with an issue kind of literally suddenly becoming a crisis because no one's caught it out before it's happened. So are you horizon scanning? Are you watching what's happening out there? I think Jake O'Neill earlier talked about the tech you need to monitor social media, to monitor what's being said. Are you doing that? And have you got systems in place to do that? And has somebody got the job of doing that? And do you do some risk assessment? And maybe your operational teams away from comms do risk assessments, do business continuity plans. Are you part of that? Is the communications team part of what's being looked at and what could possibly happen out there? So when you think about crises, they can be smouldering, they can be issues that bubble under and then suddenly leap up and become a crisis. And if you are doing that horizon scanning and you're listening, and you're social listening, but you're listening to your staff as well, and you're listening to your customers, then it might well be that you can get that crisis before it literally, or get that issue before it explodes, and suddenly the next thing you know, you have got a crisis. Sometimes an issue bubbling under, because I'm sure you'll get this in your organizations, you'll hear about things. Sometimes there's an issue which could become a crisis, and you actually can't stop it with communications. Okay, so if you think about your reputation and is about how you perform, not just how you communicate. So it could be that your product or your service isn't very good, and there are lots of complaints about it. Now, you as a comms person can't directly influence that product or that service, but you might hear about the complaints and feed that back. I once was asked to go into a housing developer, and the housing developer said, we're getting lots of complaints about our new homes, our new builds. We're getting lots of complaints, and then we're getting lots of complaints about how we deal with the complaints. So we need you to come in and media train us to deal with this. And, I think people who've done a lot more research than me will say, if a crisis isn't caused by communication, it can't be fixed by communication. And I ended up saying, do you know what? This is more than a communications issue. This is actually a quality and a product issue, and something that you need to go away and sort out. I can't literally polish, the proverbial. So you do need to sometimes flag back, if people are complaining there's an issue which could become a crisis. and it is something like customer complaints and the quality of your service, then you need to flag that back before it becomes a crisis, because that is not a comms issue, and all the comms in the world is not going to get you out of that. You know, it might do a little bit of lessening of the impact, but it needs to be stopped before it gets there. So are people listening and doing the listening internally and not just externally about what could happen? So crisis can sort of slowly come up, and very often it starts with an issue and you can stop it. Crisis can also suddenly happen, and this is an emergency. Say this is what happened in Reading. This is what happens when you get a data hack or something. It suddenly happens. But if you hold data, if you work with the public, if you work with children, if you work with animals, if you work with dangerous chemicals, then you could still horizon scan, and you can still think, actually, this could be a crisis. It might be, it happens suddenly, but that's no sort of excuse for not planning for it. So it's that planning that your business continuity team probably do. It's that planning of looking, what are the possible things that could become a crisis? Being realistic. Okay, I always say, don't think you're going to get a meteorite suddenly land on your building, because that's not so likely. But an awful lot of people, there could be. Now, I work with people who make dangerous chemicals. Let's be realistic, there could be a leak. Okay, so we need to plan for that. We're not going to just put head in the sand and not plan for that. You might hold data on people. There could be a cyber attack. Have you planned for, obviously, operationally how you deal with it, but have you also planned for communication terms of how you deal with it? So you need to do that horizon scanning and build that into your plan. And if you're thinking about planning, you could have a generic crisis plan, and you could have one that is specific to something which is either definitely going to happen because it's an upcoming court case or inquiry, or very likely to happen. So, for example, you make dangerous chemicals, what are you going to do about it? So you do need to have a think about what crisis could be on the horizon, and that may be that you work with some, if you've got a business continuity team, that maybe you work with them, and maybe you work with your sort of risk analysis team and have a look at what there is. You need to be thinking, what crisis are we actually planning for? It can also be, you know, if you think about an issue, it can become a crisis, or an emergency can become a crisis if it's massive, if it has massive impact, or if it goes on for a long time. So let's say you are a fire service and you're dealing with a major incident, and that is business as usual. That isn't a crisis, that's an incident. And I think also somebody earlier talked about, is it a crisis or is it just usual incidents, you know? So even something that starts really small, and maybe that could be criticism on social media, if it goes on and on and on and it builds, it can become a crisis. And again, if you don't either nip it in the bud, you can't always nip it in the bud, because it could be that you're a fire service, you're dealing with a major incident, then you get flooding, then you get something else happen, and suddenly we get an impact on business continuity. And this is where normal everyday workings can suddenly become a crisis. The duration can be a problem as well. So something that was an issue, that was an incident, can tip into a crisis because it's grown, it's got longer, it's carried on for days or weeks. And I think duration is something to pick up on, and quite a few people did pick up on, how do you deal with something that goes on for a long time? And this is, you know, you need to think of your team and your staff. So Donna Jordan said that you had a staggered working rota for thinking about how you dealt with the Whaley Bridge dam incident. What you don't want is everybody comes into work straight away and nobody's left after 3 or 4 days. And if you look at something like Rotherham Council and the Alexis J report, they had a problem with staffing that after a few days, because there was only so many people who could front it, and it lasted so long that it became a massive crisis. And what you then end up as well is there's no one available to deal with the media, and maybe no spokespeople available to deal with the media. So duration can catch you out. You can plan for something and then kind of get caught out, because what happens is it goes on for days or it goes on for weeks. So have a backup when you're planning. Have a backup, have a think And I really liked, I think again it was Donna who said, or somebody said, oh, it might have been Nikki from Reading, give someone a Snickers bar and a bottle of water, because the duration can be really tiring on your team. But have you got a plan so that your team can have a break, because the duration can be difficult? Have you also got a plan to maybe think about mutual aid? Do you need to talk to the LGA? Do you need to talk to a sister organisation? If there's an awful lot going on and your comms team is quite small, have you got a system whereby you could pull people in from another department to maybe help with some of the fairly sort of basic jobs that need doing? Or have you got an arrangement with another fire service or council that you could borrow some of their staff? And I think, again, that was talked about in terms of the Reading incident. Say yes to all those offers of mutual aid, because you never know when you're going to need them. But I would suggest you set them up beforehand. Maybe you talk to a neighbouring council and you have some agreement, so that when you do ring up the neighbouring council and say, can we borrow a press officer for a couple of days, it's not a surprise. So have a think again that a crisis doesn't just happen and go, it can drag on. And I've seen that catch people out, really catch people out, because the public and the media can be unforgiving. You may be several days into this crisis and they still expect somebody to be on Channel 4 News, and then someone to be on the BBC News later. And the fact that everybody's worn out and they're trying to sleep, that doesn't cut any ice. So duration can be one that catches people out, and it really, really does. And it can creep up on you when you sort of least expect it. So thinking about a crisis, one of the things about a crisis is if it can happen, it will happen, as they say. So when a crisis happens, if you're thinking about how it impacts your reputation, because a lot of my work is around thinking about reputation. I do also do some work with the Emergency Planning College about public safety, but a lot of my work is around reputation and making sure you come out of it kind of okay. When a crisis happens, there's a couple of things that will help you come out of it better. And one of them is, do you have a reservoir of goodwill? Do people trust you and like you already? Now, that is my plug there for you comms people to be out there doing the proactive comms. And I would say, that's one of the reasons. If it's the only reason you can convince people that proactive comms is worth it, then think of this. If you can build up this reservoir of goodwill, then when the bad stuff happens, which it probably will, you're not, even if you fall quite a long way, you've still got something left in the pot, as it were. You've still got some trust and some goodwill left. So if you can build up the trust that's in your organisation by doing proactive, positive PR before, you can't do it at the time, okay? You need to do it before. You may also, and this is something that a head of comms at a hospital once said to me, you may also think about ambassadors and advocates. So if something goes wrong, or just say when something goes wrong, if you've got a lot of influencers, if you want to call them influencers, ambassadors who will say good things about you, that really helps with the goodwill at the time when it happens. So it's worth having to think of, do you have a reservoir of goodwill? Have you built that up beforehand? And also, how do you deal with it? How well are you seen to deal with it? And there's all sorts of issues around the timing of the response and who do you put forward. And there's a lot to look at there, but how well do you deal with it? And we all know that the crisis situations that haven't been well dealt with, and there are obviously those that have, but it's worth having a think. So in terms of the reservoir of goodwill, how does it help? And I've always sort of said this and never found any research to back it up. So I don't know whether you had a chance to have a go at the poll that popped up there, but this is some research which showed that if you trust an organisation in a crisis, 92% of people would either definitely or probably give them the benefit of the doubt. So that's thinking about, if this is your excuse to go back to your organisation and say, we need to build up that reservoir of goodwill. We need to build up that trust, because when bad stuff happens, which it might well do, then what we know is that 92% of people are going to give us the benefit of the doubt. So if you think about it, organizations that people trust and like, they can cope with it. They can almost brush off the bad stuff when it happens. So, and I'm going to just, I think in the chat, so yeah, 40% of you actually got 92%. So, but let's have a look. Yeah, 40%, quite a lot of you got the 92%, which amazed me that it's that high. It was really, really interesting to see it's that high. So that, because I used to go on about this, I used to go on about the reservoir of goodwill, and I used to think, well, you know, is there any proof to this? Conversely, I could show you a pie chart, which is the other way around, which if you don't trust the organization, then most people will believe the negative. So you build that up beforehand so that when you go into the crisis, that people, they already think you're okay, and you're more likely to get through it with less damage to your reputation. We'll come on to how you deal with it in a second, but one of the other pitfalls I wanted to talk about was one that it comes up quite a lot again, and this could be that you have got a crisis comms plan, and I'm kind of guessing, if I could see you all and say do a show of hands, how many of you got one? And I'm guessing that most of you have. You've got some sort of crisis communications plan, and if I said, where is it? When was it last updated? Some of you will go, yeah, great, we test it all the time, it's fantastic. But some of you might be going, do you know what, actually, I'm not quite sure where it is. I've gone into organizations where they'll say, I think somebody wrote one once, don't know where it is, hasn't been updated. So this is something you need to do, is you need a plan that's a workable document. You need a crisis comms plan. It may fit into your general business continuity plan. It depends how your organization works. There's all sorts of different ways of doing it. Best if it's practical and not massively theoretical, because the danger can be you spend 20 pages explaining why the plan exists, and then there's a tiny bit at the end about what you actually do. And I would suggest that the bit about what you actually do is the important bit. So, you know, is there a plan? Does anyone know where it is? Have you also got buy-in from the senior management team? And that's really important, actually, because the danger is that the comms team have written it, and the comms team don't sit on the senior management team, and the senior management team don't know that the comms plan exists, crisis comms plan exists. And when a crisis happens, there's your CEO going out doing interviews, and you're looking at it going, hang on a second, this wasn't what we were going to do. Or there's somebody saying something, and you're looking at it going, this is not how it should be. So it's important then that you actually rehearse the plan. And the best way to rehearse a crisis comms plan is not to do it in isolation. Don't just have your comms team doing it. I mean, we often get asked by comms teams to come in and rehearse it, and we'll go, can we have at least some of the operational team in there? Because that makes it more realistic, and B, it also gets everybody thinking, if we were doing this for real, we wouldn't be working in silos. So do make sure you rehearse the plan. Test everything. Don't cheat when you rehearse it. I've sat there next to a head of comms who's just gone, right, okay, I've just written the statement and we just put the statement out, and I've gone, hang on a minute, what's your approvals process? How do you put this out? Who controls your Twitter feed? Who can put stuff on your website? Who's got the contact details? So this, again, it will make you look at that plan and actually make sure that every single link in the chain works. Because the danger is that something really simple, like how do you get onto your website, or how do you get onto your Twitter feed? People don't know that, and no one's realized that until the crisis happens. So if you do rehearse the plan and you do test the plan, do it in a way that tests it as close as you can to the real thing. Otherwise, you're just ticking a box, and it's pointless. And you will suddenly discover when the plan happens that it doesn't actually work. And I think there was also actually, and this was mentioned by, I think it was to do with Reading, and I think it was very honest response there from, is it Nikki Barton, which I thought was really fascinating. I think one of the things that Nikki said was, firstly, that the on-call comms person had to take their daughter to A&E. Well, this can happen. So does your plan have a backup system in it? And then there was someone who couldn't get onto some bit of communication. There's some press officer who couldn't get onto something. And again, do you have a backup in your comms plan because chances are it will happen on a Sunday afternoon and you haven't got a backup, a mobile number for somebody. I've had this where people have said, here's the comms plan, and all the contact details are their work emails. And then okay, there's an issue about GDPR. I totally get that. But then they've gone, oh, we don't like to put our personal contact details on there. And I'm thinking, well, that's not going to be a lot of good on a Saturday afternoon or a Sunday or bank holiday. So you need to be thinking, does this actually work, this plan? So let's practice it, let's rehearse it. And again, also, can we get senior management team in on this rehearsal? Which is difficult. I mean, I still think post-COVID, but because of COVID, crisis comms has come more to the fore. But I've seen this time and again that we go in to do this, and the CEO goes off to another meeting, which they see as more important, and they never buy into the plan. So it's really hard to use the plan in reality when they don't even know the contents, or they don't even know it exists. When you rehearse the plan, not the people. We're not trying to make everybody fail the rehearsal, but what can happen is the people in your comms team have worked together for years and know what to do. And you go through the exercise and the rehearsal really well, and you go, great, we did it brilliantly. And yeah, you're great, you're really good at it. Pat on the back for everyone. But what you didn't do was you didn't actually refer to the plan at all. You just said, well, Fred knows what to do, and Mary knows what to do, and Khalid knows what to do. And you just did it because you've worked together for so long. Now that's fine, but when people are on holiday or they leave, we haven't got a structure, we haven't got a policy and a process, and we haven't actually tested the plan. We've just tested that the people can do it. So I would say, and we've talked a lot about writing things down, make sure your plan is written down and everybody knows what their role is. It might be in reality that you don't have to refer to it very much, but it's there. It might be in reality that what happens is so off the wall that you almost have to throw the plan away and do something different. And I've heard that happen a lot of times. That's fine, but at least you've got something, a bit of a map, a roadmap to work with. So you know roughly where you're going, and everybody knows their role because it's in the plan. So that's another thing. Do practice the plan. Don't just have it as some document that disappears. I've seen so many documents that have filed away somewhere. Have it somewhere you can get at it as well, because that's the other danger. It's on someone's laptop somewhere, or it's in a cupboard somewhere, and make sure everybody knows where it is. So the plan is important. Now, I'll come on to my next kind of pitfall is, I would say, listen to the wrong people when a crisis happens. So who do you listen to? Who do you take? Whose views do you take on board? And again, if you've done some pre-planning and some rehearsals, so you might have even started drafting some sort of draft statements you could use, you don't have to do so much negotiating once the crisis happens. That's another thing. So one of the things I always bang on about is that comms people are the comms experts when it comes to a crisis. And the frustration can be that your senior management team, who've not aware of your crisis comms plan, have their own way of doing things, go into a huddle and just tell you what to do. And you end up being the people who just broadcast what they decide. So there's a couple of things with that. If you have, earlier we've talked a bit about gold, silver and bronze command, and that's the strategic, tactical and operational command. So if you have a comms person sitting in the gold command, sitting in the decision-making process, is that comms person listened to, not just there as a messenger back to the rest of the comms team? And I have seen that problem is that the comms person sitting in gold, sitting in the incident management team or the crisis management team, sometimes what happens is that comms person ends up being the messenger who takes the message, what they've decided, runs down the corridor, tells the comms team, oh, we need to put this on Twitter, or we need to put this out in a press release. So what is ideal, and this goes back to the comms profession being listened to more, would be that the comms person sits in the gold command and is listened to, or sits in that meeting and is listened to. I'd also suggest that if you have a sort of, because often there's like an agenda to these meetings where you're trying to work out what to do in an incident, and comms comes at the bottom, So all the decisions made by all the senior management team, and then the comms person is told what to do and runs down the corridor to the comms team. A couple of things there. One, firstly, yes, the comms person should have an input, because every decision you make is going to affect what people are going to do or what they're going to think of you. But equally, thinking about timing, does a comms need to be top of the agenda? So, for example, if you were the police in the Reading incident, or Donna talking about the Whaley Bridge incident, we actually need to be putting out public safety information really quickly and not waiting 20 minutes for a discussion. So my suggestion would be, if you have some sort of meeting of incident management team, comms are at the top and comms are at the bottom of the agenda. So you can put out something if it's urgent, and then the discussion happens, and then you can put out something else. So make sure as a comms person, you are listened to when the crisis happened. And also that the comms people on the ground, and again, I think this was mentioned by somebody else, can feed back into Gold about what's being said. Okay, so they're listening to you as a comms team, of picking stuff up on social media, and you need to feed back to Gold Command and tell them what's happening. So you do need to be listened to. Who do they listen to in a crisis? They listen to lawyers. Very often listen to lawyers, and lawyers are really, really, really good at worrying about what happens in court and worrying about liability, but they're not very good at thinking about reputation. So you need to have the influence and the respect of your senior management team, that they will listen to you as well. And a lot of you will have that. And I do meet a lot of comms people who say, yeah, I've got that. CEO listens to me, absolutely listens to me. But in some organizations, they'll listen to the lawyers far more than they'll listen to you. And this got touched on earlier on. I think Rachel talked about this initially, was the lawyers will pretty much always say, don't say sorry. Don't say sorry. It omits liability. And you have to think of, I think particularly someone like Thomas Cook, and the situation where two young children died on a Thomas Cook holiday due to carbon monoxide poisoning. And it took Thomas Cook, I think, was it like 9 years to apologise, because they kept being told by lawyers not to say sorry. A couple of things to think about with the word sorry, and it might be worth just looking this up. There's something called the Compensation Act of 2006, which covers England and Wales, and it actually says, I'm going to paraphrase this completely incorrectly probably, an apology or offer of redress is not in of itself an admission of liability. So what they're saying is, if you go to court armed only with an apology, unless you can prove damage and harm and negligence, you're not going to get anywhere. And I've asked lots of people, has there ever been a legal case, and correct me afterwards if you want to, has there ever been a legal case where the only evidence was saying sorry? So this fear of saying sorry, I think, is massive in organisations. It's absolutely massive, and you have to think about how that looks to the public, and think about the damage that does to your reputation. There is an issue about worrying about what your staff say if you say sorry, and I get that, and I've been through that kind of situation with people, but I think you have to there's perception, you have to sort of separate things out. You have to think about how this looks to your staff and how this looks to the public, and sometimes you have to think about, how do we look as an organisation? So this came to me way back at the beginning, working with local authorities who had really damning serious case reviews where babies had been killed, and I can remember a council leader saying, well, we're not saying sorry. And we had the serious case review. It had 21 recommendations in it, and my colleague was with me. She just waved it at them and went, I think you'll find you need to say sorry. And it sounds awful. The fact that it was an awful case, but the fact that the council said sorry, it actually meant that the story, it was top of the 6 o'clock news, and then it was kind of gone. It's an awful story, but sometimes you can minimize the damage if you just say sorry. And you have to think about medical negligence claims and how often they go on for so long. Speak to any lawyers about that, and a lot will say it's because the hospital wouldn't say sorry. And I get the concern about it, but I think it's something that we need to look at more. And I will flag up actually something called the Apology Clause campaign, which is run by a couple of PR people and a lawyer who are trying to sort this out. And there is also a private members bill which is, or I think it's one of those small, it's either private members bill or whatever they call it, one of those ones that may or may not make the law, which is about trying to get an Apologies Act in England and Wales. There is actually something in Scotland which does cover the word sorry. So that is an important thing to think about. And of course, how you say sorry. This was mentioned before, you know, how you say sorry. This was at the Oscars. And this was about trying to distance yourself from it. The error that was made, well, they made the error. What is it with people that they can't just say the error we made? And that goes back to that, you know, how you say sorry matters as well. It really, really does. At the very least, can you show some concern? And I would bring in a little phrase called concern, action, reassurance. Can you, what action are you taking? How are you going to reassure me? And can you at least show some concern, even if your lawyers are screaming at you, don't say sorry. And I have spent, one of them was connected again with a very high profile case. I think I'll say what it is, but I spent an hour and a half arguing with a lawyer about the word sorry. And luckily, the CEO finally decided that we had to say sorry, because it was such a high profile case. We just could not say sorry. Even if there was a slight risk, even if the lawyer thought there was a slight risk, it never did come to anything legally at all. So how you say sorry matters. And just one, and I hope not to deafen you too much, but you've probably seen this United Airlines one. And I will warn you, it's quite loud, but it's just thinking about how you deal with things. It really does matter.
Come on.
Airlines apologised for the overbook situation, as they called it, and yeah, nothing about the distress caused to firstly the passenger himself, and also to the people who saw that. So there is sometimes this danger as well, and this is why I think it's worth involving your senior management team in any preparation for crisis communications. There can be this danger of defensiveness, and of just not thinking about the perception outside your organization. And that's really important if you're trying to protect your reputation. How does it look? It's less about really how it is almost sometimes. It's how it looks. And I think particularly these days when everybody's got social media and everybody can post things up there, people will see this. So what do you say? And I'll just put up Dogbert for a little bit. You can see that. This is, I just put this up because it's not unknown for organizations to use their corporate messaging, even in a really negative situation. So I've seen companies that have been criticized nationally say things like, yes, but we're award winning. And you have to think, hang on a minute, that's totally inappropriate in this situation. So you need to have a think, you know, when something happens, what are your messages going to be? Not all that corporate spiel and those mission statements and those values, and they can completely get in the way. I know you wouldn't do that, but I've seen it with very sort of managers who don't get it, who just don't get the public perception of it, and they'll say, yeah, we're award winning, you know, and get it all wrong. So you have to think about what is your messaging and make sure you're clear about it, and obviously make sure you know who the spokesperson is as well. That's another thing to think about, and that person is comfortable doing this kind of interview. And I think I will just touch back onto something that Donna Jordan touched on briefly at one point, was when you're dealing with organizations where it's a multi-agency approach to something and there's partners involved. I really like that saying, which I think Donna said, and I've heard it from other people: there's one version of the truth and one version of the truth only. And that's important when you're working with partners. If you're working with partners and you know something's coming up or is likely to, can you work with them? We all know it's not always that easy, as this is the theory. Can you work with them so that you are saying the same thing? And particularly in a situation where people's lives may depend on it, you definitely need to be saying the same thing. And I've been in organisations, worked with organisations where the company's saying one thing and the fire service is saying another, and people don't know whether to leave their homes or shut the windows or do whatever. So you need to, again, what are you going to say? Make sure it's consistent, and it definitely is one version of the truth and one version of the truth only. And my final thought, which is from a council leader in the Midlands, and I love this. I just thought this kind of takes it all back to it. You can do all the spin in the universe and you can do all the clever comms in the universe, but as he said, there you go, don't do the bad stuff in the first place. So thank you for that. Thank you ever so much. And that kind of comes around with all my pitfalls and mistakes that I think it is possible to make, and hopefully you won't do. Thank you.